So now let's turn to spirituality. And spirituality is, of course, difficult to define, as I said earlier in the lecture. And if you look in the reading, you'll notice that I don't give a direct definition of it. And I don't think we need one. I'm not going to test you on some definition of spirituality. I purposefully leave it open, and I leave us to define our own spirituality. But I provide a lot of ideas and concepts and, basically ideas and concepts that will help you with your own understanding of spirituality. Because this part of the lecture, this part of the class, is actually supposed to be a bit more personal. And so we'll discuss a number of things related to spirituality here. And then one of the things that's going to be really important is this difference you see on the PowerPoint there between what's called an inference to oneself and an inference to another. And this comes from some of the ancient philosophers we discussed, and I thought it's really useful. Because it's exactly what it sounds like. Like, if you make an inference for another, that was more what the San people were doing when they were saying things like, okay, you have to, I'm going to give you my argument about this animal track, and I want you to critique it, and we want to figure out what the best course of action is, right? That's an inference for another, to debate amongst people, right? It's like you're talking with your friends. I want to give you my best argument for socialism. Try to counter me. I want to see what my weaknesses are, whatever it is. But an inference to oneself is when you turn that logical capacity that we're learning in this class inwardly on you, right, on your own thoughts. And as we saw when we talked about cognitive biases in particular, this can be quite difficult because we have a human nature where we don't want to look at ourselves. And so part of spiritual development is looking honestly, internally, using logic on our own beliefs and ideas. Okay, so let's talk, I mentioned before Stoicism and CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. Let's talk a little bit about that. And like I said, this is a really good tradition to draw from because it really focuses, Stoicism, let's start with Stoicism. Stoicism really focuses our lives on the immediate present thing that's happening, right? Whatever that is, whether it's a negative emotion because you got in a fight with your partner, or it's a traffic jam, or it's because you're worried because you have a philosophy exam coming up, or whatever it is, right? Or you got to give a speech in a speech class, whatever it is. Stoicism basically says fundamentally that, hey, look, if you can't control something, don't worry about it, right? If something is out of your control, you have to respect that and appreciate that and realize that you can only control a small amount of things in this world. And what can you control? Stoics basically say, well, your thoughts and reactions, that's about it. Right? You can, now, to be fair, there are some Stoics who say you can influence the world. Like, for instance, you can influence the world by voting. But, of course, you can vote and the person you voted for doesn't get elected. That happens all the time. So, in terms of direct control, though, Stoics argue that we only can control our internal mental thoughts and our reactions to, like emotional reactions to stuff. And once you realize that, so much suffering comes, according to Stoics, from the idea that we think we can control things, right? We get mad when that person doesn't like us, but you can't control whether somebody likes you, right? We get mad at the traffic, but you can't control whether traffic happens. Ergo, therefore, from the Stoic perspective, it's totally useless and counterproductive to get angry at things you can't control, or to get sad, or to experience life negatively over something that you have absolutely no control over. Now, like I said, this can connect to different belief systems, because even if you're an atheist, you can appreciate the logic in that, right? You can appreciate that, that doesn't require you to believe in any type of God. And even if you do believe in a type of God, you can attribute what's happening in the world more to God's plan, right? You can say, well, God's plan is the way it is. I have to accept God's plan, right? So it's the idea, we'll talk a bit later about acceptance. It's so important, acceptance of the way things are. As that second bullet point says there, right? In a nutshell, Stoicism says to accept the world as it is and don't fight against what you cannot change. And then, as I mentioned before, just to highlight it, CBT is a method that draws from that and we'll talk later about specific examples of how to prevent yourself from kind of not accepting things, right? How to actually accept things as they are. Now, two of the most famous Stoics, interestingly, see the guy on the left there who says, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Right? That's Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor, who actually was one of the most famous Stoics, and wrote a book called The Meditations, where that comes from, that I highly recommend taking a look at. But notice what he's saying, exactly what I was saying there, right? Power over your mind and not outside events. You can control your thoughts and reactions, but not the world around you. And what I like about this quote is he says, if you realize this, you'll find strength. And I want to focus on that for a second. Because spirituality is about having an internal strength. That's what happens when you accept stuff. When you deny stuff, like when you behave in a way that you don't like that you behaved, maybe you got mad at a friend one time, and you thought of yourself as a calm person, but then you went outside, but then you think to yourself like, oh no, I can't believe I did that. Like, what am I? You're not accepting who you are, because clearly it happened that you reacted that way. It doesn't mean you're not a generally calm person, but it means you're a calm person who sometimes gets mad, right? Whatever it is, that's just one example. You find strength in acceptance, is what I'm trying to say, right? When you really accept and say, yeah, no, that really happened. Now, if you look at the right there, this is a famous quote from another Stoic named Epictetus, who, by the way, was a Roman slave. And now that alone shows you something interesting about Stoicism, that you can be a Stoic whether you're at the top end of society as an emperor or at the lowest end as a slave, right? And the point is that external events aren't that important. So Epictetus, this ancient Roman slave, he found peace within his mind, even though his own body didn't belong to him. Just as the Roman emperor found peace within his mind, even though he had all the material possessions in the world. So for Stoics, it's not about the external world. Again, that's what that point illustrates. It's about your relationship to it, the internal strength that you find, your acceptance of yourself and of the world around you, and understanding what you can and cannot control. So that quote from Epictetus says, just going along with what I just said, it is not the things in themselves which trouble us, but our reactions, opinions of those things. Sorry, sometimes it's translated differently. But our opinions of those things, right? It's the way, it's not that somebody said a mean thing to you, it's whether you let it bother you, right? Do you let it bother you and think about it and run it over in your head? I can't believe she said that. What a rude cashier, or whatever, right? That's the question. That's what's going to determine whether you're happy in a moment-to-moment level or have a state of peace, if you don't like the word happiness. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of Stoicism and CBT. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about acceptance. Because like I said before, it's really fundamentally important. Acceptance is, in my opinion, it's the one thing, like if you hear nothing else I've been saying here, hopefully you hear this idea of acceptance, of accepting things as they are, yourself and the world around you, all right? So for instance, when we're bored as humans, we tend to blame external circumstances, right? Like, oh, I went to this party, it was really boring, I didn't have a good time. That professor is so boring, right? The lectures are so boring. I'm not saying there's not some truth to people making things more exciting, whether it's a party or a lecture. But fundamentally, that's your choice to be bored, right? That's maybe you don't agree with that, but think about it. Because what is boredom? Boredom is a rejection of the now. What do people do when they're bored? They're kind of antsy. They're like, oh God, I just want to get out of here. I just want to like move on. I want to do something else, right? That suggests that the here and now that you're in, you can't handle it, right? You're not accepting that moment. And people who have meditated for long periods of time in their lives will often report that they're much less bored all of the time in their lives, even in situations that used to bore them. Like, for instance, waiting in a doctor's office to see the doctor or dentist or whatever, that's normally, they're just perfectly fine. The point I'm trying to make there by talking about boredom is that acceptance has to do with our whole lives, like accepting who we are, who our friends are, who our family is, who our people in our family are, the world as it is, but also your moment-to-moment, immediate, direct experience. That's a huge part of acceptance in spirituality. Okay, that third point is a huge one. Acceptance doesn't mean liking something. Right? This is a huge misunderstanding that I see among a lot of people who are not just opposed to acceptance, as I'm talking about it here, but are generally opposed to spirituality, overall. And often say things like, well, how am I supposed to be all spiritually advanced and enlightened when there's terrible things going on in the world? Look at all the racism, look at all the wars, look at all the crap. And the point I would make in response to that accepting things doesn't mean liking them. Right? It doesn't mean condoning them, and it doesn't mean you don't do anything to influence and make things better. Right? You can be a full-blown activist who is working in your community to help communities come together to fight against whatever, oppression, and you can still accept things as they are, right? So acceptance isn't liking. And actually, to connect us to cognitive behavioral therapy, there's this great quote in here on page... So first of all, they define the CBT researchers who have studied acceptance in sort of a clinical, more academic setting with actual patients. On page 29 at the top, this is what some of the researchers have said. Acceptance as we mean it is the voluntary adoption of an intentionally open, receptive, flexible, and non-judgmental posture with respect to moment-to-moment experience, right, as I was just saying. A willingness to make contact with distressing private experiences or situations, right? To accept what's happening, to kind of just go like, okay, yes, this really happened, instead of avoiding it or denying it or lying to yourself. And above that, I have I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the Serenity Prayer, which makes a similar point from Scripture, right? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, courage to change what I can, and wisdom to know the difference, right? This is yet another way that a major spiritual tradition, Christianity, can go and link with this whole discussion of spirituality. But getting back to the liking something, acceptance not being liking, look at the next page on page 30. More from those CBT researchers, they say acceptance does not mean wanting or liking something, wishing it were here, or judging it to be fair, right, or proper. It does not mean leaving changeable situations unchanged. It means to embrace experiences as they are by choice and in the moment. Right? So that's what acceptance is all about. Embracing things as they are in the moment.